Hello, OLAB and friends. This is Evan Wing back again. We're here with Joseph Seering, who's been with us before. Today, we are going to be talking about proactive moderation tools and tactics, basically getting ahead of the curve and building systems for moderating your communities before you have an issue that needs to be moderated. So, first of all, Dr. Joseph Seering, which is a status change since last time we chatted. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Tell the audience who you are and what you're doing these days.
Well, hi, everyone. Good to be here. I am a postdoc, a researcher at Stanford in the computer science department. And my research is about lots of things related to moderation. I mostly focus on communities in moderation, so things like Facebook groups and Twitch channels and subreddits, but the kind of things that are communities that are user run.
Right. Excellent. So when I asked, do you have things you want to talk about? You said, yes, I'm actually doing some work in the realm of proactive moderation. Tell me a little bit about that. What are you working on these days?
So the background is, as over the past 6-ish years mostly, as there's been an increase in conversation about content moderation and trust and safety on online platforms, a lot of what gets talked about is removal. So do we remove this? Do we remove that? How much gets removed? What are our percentages? How much stuff is left up that should have been removed? All of these questions that are mostly focused around removal. And I think one of the contributors to that has been kind of the philosophy of moderation as something that should be sort of procedurally criminal justice styled in the recently we had perspective from Elon Musk that content moderation should only remove stuff that's illegal, which
Right.
of course isn't a perspective that holds up very well under questioning. But this idea generally that moderation is governance in this criminal justice sense, where we have rules and we punish people who break them, and that's what moderation does.
Right.
And over the past while, as I've been doing research into moderation, as I talk to moderators, and I've now done 120-ish, I think, interviews with moderators.
Wow.
On a bunch of different platforms. This is not how they view moderation for the most part. There are some spaces where it is, but for the most part, the role of being a moderator is something that's much broader, much more interconnected, much more of a social thing, much more of a thinking about how to cultivate a community type of role. My kind of long-term goal is to help bring that breadth into how we talk about moderation, both within communities and at companies, and maybe someday in policy, but that's unlikely to happen in the short term, I guess. So the topic of proactive moderation is one that I'm really interested in now and over the past year, and probably for a few years to come. Which is the idea of building a community in such a way that it becomes a healthy, productive, positive space, rather than just focusing on cleaning stuff up after the fact, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I know this is something that the communities think a lot about often. Moderators think about how to cultivate a space, but it's not really part of the formal public conversation. Like, if you have a transparency report from Facebook, how do they report that they cultivated an X% more positive space without talking about removals?
Right.
It's not how they've framed the conversation. They don't.
Well, and by
they
the time you
framed
get
it
to removals, things have already gone astray. You've already ended up in a place where there's a problem.
Right. Yeah. So their way of saying that they have more positive space would be saying that there's less stuff to remove.
Right.
But like there isn't a framing of this that in the public debate discussion, which aligns with the reality of cultivation, which is that it's like not, the output measure is not, X% removed. The output measure is a more positive space in line with the community's goals. And that's not something that fits in a transparency report very well as they've been conceived so far.
It's interesting because it reminds me of the somewhat tongue-in-cheek comment that Y2K, the Y2K bug, is just a cultural blip that didn't level society because a bunch of people paid attention to it before it took us out. And it feels very similar that, like, moderation, you only see it if there's a problem that has to be resolved. And what you're talking about is, instead of being some sort of police officer at the end of the process that introduces punitive measures, moderators as gardeners that are setting things up in advance so that they grow in productive ways.
Yes, absolutely. And this is like a very human way that things happen, right? When we have back in the day when we had offline communities, some of us still do, but in our, I don't know, our book clubs or our community theater productions, the social structure is not people break rules and they get punished. There's like this whole set of activities that goes into cultivating space and like maybe pulling people aside when things aren't going right and having a conversation about things and this wonderfully complex set of social interactions that just that are fundamentally human and have not been built into platforms or into reporting about platforms.
It starts as simple as I show up for auditions and I get greeted enthusiastically. I show up for auditions and I look around and go, oh, everybody's body language is open and I feel welcome here. Or I show up and I've been a bad actor in other communities and everybody is closed off. And it's subtle, but it's really foundational.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite examples for one piece of this is like when you're standing around in a circle in I don't know, your coworker happy hour or equivalent, and somebody says something that is not so great. You can see the body language of everybody in that circle be like, and that person, if they're perceptive enough, can see that what they said didn't get the desired reaction.
Yeah.
And that is not a thing that is naturally built into platforms. We don't get to see those like subtle, very human cues about like, oh, that didn't go over well, or even watching somebody else and seeing how somebody else acts and how that goes over is not built into these platforms. And there's actually kind of a funny in a moderation joke kind of way fact, which is that when I talk about proactive moderation, I'm talking about things that are done before stuff goes wrong. When companies talk about proactive moderation, usually the industry standard, they mean stuff is moderated proactively if it's captured before it has impact, before somebody reports it before. So like already after the thing has already happened, but the company is really on top of getting rid of it quickly. That's proactive, but that's a very different meaning than what I'm talking about. So there's this distinction in terminology, but I think also in kind of philosophy that of moderation being reactive after the fact versus more cultivating. And when I do sometimes talk to people at companies about these sorts of things, and the reaction is that they generally absolutely would love to be able to do more with building tools and designing things for the cultivating pieces, but it's not it's not the path they're on, and they sort of see it as a luxury when they're still trying to figure out how to do the reactive stuff better.
Right.
And it's hard to make the argument that like you
need to do
wouldn't
less
need to.
reactive stuff if you retrofit.
Yeah. The easiest way to moderate is not to have to moderate because your community is great.
Yep.
If you're talking about moderation, you get what I mean. But like, you can get a lot of value into putting that work up front, both within a community and as a platform, I think. But that's not the focus in platforms. The focus has been on finding better ways to remove stuff or prevent certain stuff from being posted or time people out, or all of these different tools. And those are important. Like, you need tools to remove stuff. And realistically, in large communities, you need some automated way to identify stuff. Like, if you have a team of moderators who's dealing with 1,000 posts being posted every minute in some of these very large spaces, they can't review every post. They need some support. So those things are important.
It's interesting because I've had similar conversations around building convention spaces, where if you are retrofitting a convention that has existed for 5, 10, 20 years, you are so much more likely to end up needing more punitive measures. You need to outline what those processes look like. And the convention spaces that are just now starting to think about what community curation looks like are all building those reactive models, and that's where a lot of their energy goes. And it's a big leap to be like, no, like you start with the foundational, who's welcome here, what isn't welcome here, how do we communicate that, how do we express this? And I frequently, when I get to talk to a convention that's either a fan convention or a gaming convention that's just starting, I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are in a really exciting place, because you get to decide from the foundation, and each one of your building blocks goes into what do we value and how do we express those values. And there is absolutely that same resistance in spaces, in physical spaces, to pivoting and being like, okay, so if we explicitly say, it is okay to say we don't do that here, that's hard. And we have to like overcome people being shy, and we have to overcome people not liking to hear that. And how do we teach people? But if the space starts with oh yeah, if someone's being a little off color, you just say not here, or not at my table, or we'll talk about it later. And everybody goes, oh, okay, I've got this. And so it's interesting that technologically powered spaces are running into the same things that I see in physical spaces and in safety conversations and community curation conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big challenge, pretty much right along the lines of what you said, is that on platforms like Twitch, there are a whole lot of different spaces right next to each other with very different norms.
Oh, absolutely.
It's very possible that a person could have been watching a stream where it's like mostly anything goes in the chat, and then they go to a different community and they try to behave like that, and it totally doesn't fly there, and they get confused and upset, like they just didn't understand. And this segues very nicely into what I was gonna go to next, which is something that I and some other folks that I've been talking with have been thinking about for a long time, which starts with a very fundamental question of why do people break rules? And you can put those into very kind of basic categories, and we can maybe see if if anybody else is hanging out in chat and wants to participate. We can see if we can come up with some categories. But the first one is, for example, a person wants to break a rule, they know it's a rule, and they go ahead and do it anyway. So that is case number one. And we can just sort of go and list from there. And feel free to jump in with other variants in that.
So we've got like defiance.
Defiance, yeah, that's a good way to put it. They know it's wrong or against the rules. Do it anyway.
Rebellion, right?
Rebellion,
There's the I disagree with this rule.
Yeah, there's it's subversive. That can be adjacent to subversive behavior, or civil disobedience in some cases. These being aware of the rules, but like having a goal in breaking them.
Okay. Yep.
There's, but in all of those cases, there's two elements that are the same. One is they know what the rules are, and two is they have an intention. So what happens when we start thinking about other cases where, like, actually they didn't know what the rules were?
Right.
So that's a whole other category, which is like, one case would be like, I wandered in the space, I didn't know how to behave, and I accidentally broke a rule, which certainly happens. That is a thing that happens all the time.
Unspoken rules that aren't anywhere that anyone can point to or that haven't been spoken out loud.
Right. Absolutely. That's a good one. That's a good one to keep in mind. I think I don't actually have that on my mental list, so I'll have to add that.
The people tripping over the like social norm. So there's I frequently, because I operate in game spaces where fantasy genres happen and where there's a lot of appropriation of Romani culture, right? And the common word for Romani is gypsy, and that's a slur. It is, in Europe, it's like dropping the N-bomb in polite conversation. You will just grind a conversation to a halt, and everybody will stare at you like you have dog poop on your shoes. And that is a thing that Americans just don't know is a problem. And so entering shared spaces with Europeans, like, sometimes I have to pull someone aside and be like, oh, no. I know that you were like quoting a song or you were completely, but we don't say that here. And you look like kind of a backwater. I lost every word there, but the intent there, right, is like shifting social mores, that changing from group to group. Sometimes there's just really broad things that you can't see until you step in it.
Yep. And I think the response you just talked about of pulling a person aside and saying, hey, you probably didn't, I guess you didn't know this, but we don't do that here because this is a very core social process. It is not a process that features have really been built for into platforms.
Honestly, community, like physical space communities, are terrible at it. There's usually 1 to 5 people, depending on how big your community is, that has the social skills and the confidence to pull someone aside and say with certainty, oh, here's why we don't, and to hold their ground when the person has an emotional reaction. Because when you get called in, it's easy to feel negatively and have a reaction. And learning those skills is not intuitive, because we want people to like us. We want people to be happy with us. And being the person that pulls someone aside and says, you couldn't have known, but that diplomat skill is not taught very often.
Yeah, and that's also perfect. We can sort of tease apart the different cases and outcomes there. There's like a person, so given the situation where a person says something like that, which they didn't know is a slur, but is, there are a few different ways that conversation could go, right? There's like the person says, oh, my bad, I didn't know, I won't do that again. Or there's the case where the person says, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way. People need to relax and take, that sort of thing. And it takes a certain set of skills to ideally shift people toward the first one rather than the second, but also to identify when a person is not going to move toward the first and maybe will not be a productive member of the community in this regard. So there's all of these nuances there.
And there's an iterative process. Like, speaking from experience, if the first time I say to somebody, hey, that's not okay, or the first time the conversation happens in public, if I come down really hard and heavy, I'm going to get a lot more resistance. If I say lightly, oh, we're going to talk about that later, just put a pin in this, we're not, like, that's not okay, but we'll pick this conversation up later. And then I take them aside, or we have the conversation, or someone will say, actually, I'm curious, can you explain? And there's a finessing, and there's a having that conversation in a productive way, so that the next time when someone says, hey, that's a little off color, that doesn't match here, there's not as much of a defensive reaction. And so a lot of what you're talking about is very iterative, and I exist in a lot of spaces where that process, I have to start at the beginning, and I have to be like, okay, so I'm not calling you a racist, I'm not calling you whateverist, but, and I can shortcut that in our home convention, and I can be like, we'll talk about this off screen. And people go, oh, okay. But if I'm in a new space, I have to start from the ground up and say, I'm not saying that you are sexist. I'm saying that there are some choices in this space that are exclusionary.
Right. And that takes a lot of nuance and context awareness and social skills to make that work. And of course, in some cases, it just won't, no matter what. So
how do you incentivize that buy-in?
Well, so this is part of a broader arc. I want to finish the list of why people break rules, but no, I want to come back to that. But just to wrap up the list, another one, just sort of toggling the different levers or variables we've been talking about. Another one is didn't know what the rules were and didn't care.
Right.
Which is different from knew what the rules were and broke them anyway. Though they often have the same outcomes, it's a different category. And then there's one of my favorites. I guess favorite is the wrong word, but I think one of the ones that we don't think about that often, or at least certainly in online spaces, is knew the rules, got carried away, got heated, and broke them. But normally would have followed them. And that is, I think, a different case from all of the other ones, and one that probably happens a lot in online spaces, but we don't measure that. We don't quantify it. We just sort of, so that is another case. And my approach with my team, I have some really fantastic students who I've been working with on this project direction, has been to look at those different cases and try to identify like which of those we have the most leverage to stop before they happen.
Sure.
There are certain types of behaviors, like a spam bot, doesn't matter what you say to it, it's going to spam. But somebody who is in a situation where they're getting heated and carried away, that's probably a person where you may have some leverage to intervene and say, hold on, like take 5, take a breather and come back or something.
Right.
Like you're not banned, you're not whatever, but
but time out.
Yeah, just like take a minute, cool off, or think carefully about what you say next.
Yep.
So that's a spot that has really, in digital spaces, particularly designed by platforms, has not received a lot of attention. But it is my theory that aside from the really terrible stuff that's going to happen, regardless of who you talk to, of the remaining stuff, I think a lot of it is either people getting carried away, people getting heated, or people not knowing the rules. And all of those have this sort of common thread, which is that if you got in there before things went wrong, you could prevent it from going wrong most of the time.
Right.
So that's kind of the core of this approach, and it's not a radical idea. Like, people have been doing this forever, right? This is fundamental human social behavior. It's just not something that has translated to Facebook groups or subreddits outside of people going out and doing it on their own initiative. It's not something that's built in, this idea. Right. It's not part of the philosophy of the design. And when I talk to moderators, when I interview moderators, they'll often talk about things like tiered warning systems. Like, you break a rule the first time, your message gets removed, but that's it. The second time you get a timeout, the third time you get banned, or something like that.
Right.
But even that is kind of still missing the lead up to that point, interventions. So that's a lot of what we've been focused on. And there's a whole lot of different ways to do that. One that has been getting more attention, I think, on platforms is posting rules more clearly. And there's a long way to go on platforms in terms of doing that. And I would really love to be able to play with some designs, because I think there's much better ways to do that in many cases. But that has gotten a little attention. Like, you've seen, as of a few years ago, there's the rules pop up when you click on a Twitch chat box, and you have to click OK, got it, which I think has been the same for a while. And I don't know that it's super effective, but at least a person has to see the rules once if they read them. I don't know. I don't know the stats on how many people actually read those, but it's better than nothing. On Facebook groups, I think, and Discord specifically, they've added features for putting the rules in front of you more clearly. That's more recent, and of course, people have been doing that with codes of conduct and having to click accept before you can see the server. That's fairly common on at least a certain set of Discord servers. So this...
It wasn't 2 years ago when we started doing that. It was actually very novel, and we had to figure it out from the ground up before we found examples of other servers that did it. So it's a relatively new development.
Yes, absolutely. New within, like you said, just the past couple of years, that has become more common, and it's starting to get built into platforms. Though still, again, not, I think, in optimal ways, but more than before.
Right.
The piece that really hasn't gotten a lot of development support, from my perspective, is the stepping in and nudging somebody away from a problem ahead of time. So that's what we're doing. Cool. And we're testing on Discord, and I can show you what we built, but it's a very simple tool. It is basically a moderator can right-click on a message and press a button, and that person will get a private notification saying, you haven't broken a rule, you're not in trouble, but, like, be careful, with some more detail than that. And we're testing that in some different medium to large size servers, and basically we're very privacy conscious and such, so we are not tracking the actual interactions, but we do see usage data, and we're interviewing the moderators. So we see that they're using the thing, and they tell us that in certain circumstances it's useful, and in certain circumstances it's not. So that's kind of where we are with the process. It's intended to be a very easy 2-click private nudge that is not a confrontation. It is a kind of you might not have known, but just FYI, you're close to a line.
Oh, interesting. There's something similar. I help moderate a Facebook group where now when you decline a post or when you remove a post, you can actually select which of the community rules was broken. Mm-hmm. And so there's real time, like, this got rejected because.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's interesting that there's a parallel there.
Yes, and that is a thing. Like the removal reasons exist on a couple of spaces. I'm not quite sure how it works on each different platform, but reasons for removal and explanations for removal are a new-ish but growing thing. The goal of this is it's to be sent on messages that aren't even getting removed.
I would love that. I would love the option to be like, hey, this doesn't quite follow the rule. Do you want to edit? Right? Even with a yes, no, like, yes, I'll go edit it, or no, just remove it. I would save so much time.
Well, that's the hope. I guess I can probably screen share now.
Excellent.
Let me. I'll just make I have a demo server. Demo. I'm just gonna make a new channel.
Oh no.
How do I? Okay. I'll turn off my camera and then share my screen.
Let's see. That should get us there eventually.
Okay. So that will maybe do it.
Yep, give me just a second. As soon as I tell it to watch the stream, come on, give me my mouse back. Thank you. Okay. So let me just confirm that OBS is doing the thing I asked it to do. Yep. It's loading the stream still.
Am I properly sharing?
I don't think so.
Let's see. It might be on my end. I'm getting an error.
Nope, I still have 2 blue dancing dots.
Yeah, me too. That's weird. I'll give it one more try and I guess maybe not. Can you share your screen? Like, because I can invite you and you can watch the thing.
We can try, sure. Let me. How would I go about doing that? People who've watched any of the streams so far are aware that I am, in fact, not the most adept OBS user, and so we do the best we can here. So yes, I think I can. So I'm sorry, how would you be inviting me to see it?
I just added you on a server where it is working. It's my server, MMOND.
Give me a second and see if I can actually. Ooh, what is happening? All right, folks, thank you for bearing with us. Your server. Oh, you need to invite OLAB.
Oh, OLAB. 1 second.
Yep.
Actually, can I disappear for 10 seconds and rejoin real quick?
Absolutely. Go back over to Discord and convince it that it wants to pay attention to what you're saying. Give me a second. There we go. And then back to OBS and convince it that I actually do mean that I want it to show that. Give me just a second.
No problem.
Discord. So we want...
I probably should have... I've been using Discord on this computer for years, so I probably should have figured out the screen sharing at this point, but...
It's okay.
It took me a minute.
Well, there's a weird thing where I don't get my mouse at first when I change over to full screen Discord on the PC that I'm using. And so it takes me just a second to navigate around. Why? There we go. So I want to not show. Focus. Come on. Okay, well, I guess I can get it to cooperate other ways. What is happening? All right, well, we're just going to do this brute force way. Okay. I'm going to add a window capture back in. This has been my week, is OBS decides that it's going to throw a little bit of a tantrum about something at the moment that I need it to behave.
Yeah, I've had those issues with OBS.
So what am I looking at? Okay. So that is actually what I want it to look like. Make you a little smaller. Plop you in the middle of our screen and transition. All right, there we go. They can see what you're showing.
Okay. So you can see my demo channel?
Yep.
Okay. So imagine this is a comment where somebody is being almost problematic. So imagine you have this comment. The tool that we have is very simple. This is a lot of work. I'm sorry for like a 30-second demo, but
oh sure.
The flow is just like this. You click the message, and then you click gentle warning, and they get a nudge. And now if you scroll up, and I've nudged myself a lot, so you can ignore the but messages. But you get this message that is like, take care. And this message is customizable. We've got other ones. But this is just the flow. It's very simple, straightforward. Click the message, you pick what type of warning they get, and that's it. It's not punitive, it's just a nudge.
Right.
So that's pretty much the whole flow. And it sends, logs and the things that bots do. But that's pretty much all of it.
And so
this is
from the user perspective, from the moderator perspective, I imagine that is not what I wanted. Okay. That they already have this language sort of pre-built where they are anticipating, right? They do these things, and having the ability to just take the language that they've already agreed on and transfer it over to how they're to the automatic two-click system seems like a lot less overhead and a lot more compassionate for your moderators.
Yeah, so there's different use cases for this. There's the cases, so this is not a tool that we're imagining every server should use. There's servers that really want to pull people aside and have a conversation with them. And that's great. I'm 100% for that. This is more for the situations where moderators don't have bandwidth or don't feel the need to have a full in-depth conversation, or maybe they want to do something that isn't, that like feels less confrontational because it's coming from a bot on the side rather than from directly a moderator. So this is a specific set of use cases mostly for kind of mid-sized servers that don't have the capacity to talk to everybody, but still want to take a little bit of a proactive approach in kind of setting people these nudges before they break a rule. And what we've seen in working with different servers is they each have slightly different language. Like we have just the default built-in NSFW nudge, which is basically like this content should be somewhere else. So like, be careful, only post this in the appropriate channels. And some servers, of course, don't have appropriate channels for that because they don't want any NSFW stuff. So each server customizes a little bit.
Right.
And some like one server added a nudge that was like, that's too many memes, basically, because that's something that they care about. So this is pretty much the flow. It's not intended by any means to replace the taking people aside, but it is intended to hopefully replace the having to remove stuff after the fact, because people don't break rules once they understand how they're supposed to behave.
So a thing that I'm curious about that I imagine you don't have data on yet and haven't had a chance to dig into, but I'm really curious to hear the outcome on what the difference is in response from the user base if they know that it's something that has been triggered by a person versus something that has, if they perceive that it's, quote, just a bot.
Yeah, that's something we're very interested in. And I think I'll be done screen sharing for the moment.
Okay. Yep.
But there are a few different questions to consider. There's the variable between like this is sent by a bot versus this is sent by a human, and there's the variable of like this is customized about specifically what I said, and there's a person who wrote it, versus this is just like a generic kind of nudge. And I think each of those probably matters in different ways. The idea behind the bot, and I don't know if this is correct, it feels correct to me, but if I were accidentally getting close to crossing a line, it would feel less aggressive or less hostile. I'm not sure what the right word is.
Confrontational?
Confrontational is a good word. To have a bot message than to have one of the, the big powerful moderators direct message me, because that feels serious.
Right.
So that's one hypothesis, which is that it's maybe in some cases less likely to get this pushback. And also, they can't push back. The bot doesn't, it doesn't read the messages it's sent. There's nothing in the code to even record that. But there's also, of course, the fact that it's less personal, which has different impact. And I think this is kind of a question of like, what are the complementary pieces? What would you do in different situations? And I think this approach is probably good for the situation where there's a need to do these sort of higher volume of less personal nudges for people who just sort of commonly make a fairly simple mistake.
Right.
There's not a need to really pull somebody aside and have a conversation. There's the need for the whatever you do by sending somebody a look in a group conversation, that kind of thing.
Right.
So some sort of equivalent of that is able to be done at scale without moderators having to take the time to pull everybody aside and having a conversation with them, which a lot of spaces just don't have the bandwidth for.
It's interesting because I spend a lot of time, because I operate in gamer spaces and in nerd spaces, I spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that a lot of us either learn to socialize or learn to socialize from people who learned to interact during an era when how you earned your social capital in online spaces was through flame wars. And And so having something where you can just like throw some water on that before it starts smoldering and just be like, hey, not today, right? Like, not now, not today. Seems really useful from just the perspective of like, just tone it down, just bring the temperature down a little.
I hope so, but it's also a question of like, given that situation, what is the best way to do it? Is the best way to step in public and like at the person as a moderator and say, "Hey, chill," which sometimes happens, and it's maybe in some cases the best situation is the best case to pull somebody aside. Like, there's all of these questions, but this is a tool intended for some use cases.
Right.
And
I'm sure that some of that has to do with how the community interacts with social capital. Like, does somebody need to be a bigger fish in order to shut something down? Or is there a situation where there needs to be some caretaking if something is shut down? Do they feel personally targeted? And this, I think, reduces the amount of overall caretaking necessary for being like, hey, just not today, dudes. And so I'm fascinated. My brain is buzzing on the like, how does the fact that this has the perception of being impassive and impartial and separate and off screen from your moderators in a lot of ways, and just being like, hey, don't do that. And I'm excited to hear more about what you discover about how that manifests in the spaces.
Yeah, we're still learning what the right niche is. We kind of knew from the beginning that this wasn't helpful for very small spaces where everybody knows each other already, because in those spaces, either if they're very small, they either kind of like don't have that many conflicts, and when they do, they can work them out socially, or people will talk, or they already know each other all offline, and so on. So not as useful for those spaces, and also not useful for the spaces where public discourse about all of these things is really important, where like whenever something happens, the whole community wants to discuss it.
Right.
Obviously, this doesn't do that. But it seems more useful for these sort of mid-sized to larger servers where there isn't bandwidth or need to do that for all cases, but the moderators still want to have this option. And also there's a piece in it about, in particularly large spaces, it doesn't open moderators up to attack in the same way.
Yep.
You don't have a DM then open with a moderator who you can harass. Great. Or there's not an obvious target for your rage.
I also, as somebody who moderates spaces, I like the fact that it gives a very clear indicator of how somebody responds to correction. Because as a moderator, I have to assess every time I reach out to somebody and pull them aside, how likely are they to respond positively, right? If we're in a physical space, like, am I doing this so that they feel called out? Am I doing this in a way that I'm putting myself in physical harm by pulling someone aside and like trying to be discreet about the conversation? In online spaces, it seems to me like a really good way to tell the difference between somebody who is being subversive or defiant versus somebody who just doesn't know. And if their immediate reaction is, oh, didn't know, sorry, and they just stop the behavior, that gives your moderators a ton of information about what the next steps are, right? If they grouse or if they start sniping passive aggressively, then that's a whole different decision tree and it keeps your moderators out of the fray until they've got that information. And that seems like a really powerful tool for moderators.
Yes, I hope so. And that's so sort of the next direction. We're in the phase of like, will moderators use this? And the answer seems to be, for certain types of spaces, yes. The first round of servers we tested with, the ones that used it consistently have continued using it after the end of the study.
That's fantastic.
Which is great. So if they found it useful, they continued finding it useful after they were done getting paid for using it, which is great. So solid evidence for certain types of servers will use this or a tool of this sort. The next question is like, how well does it work? And what is it good at? And can we measure that? And that presents some kind of interesting challenges to measure, in part because, well, number one, there's good reasons not for moderators to not want to run experiments with these things. Like, it's dangerous to just play with behavior in your social space. And as researchers, we don't want to like cause a community to fail to see what happens. So we're talking about ways to do this, to do testing that aren't likely to cause harm to the communities. But also, in order to really measure an effect, we need enough instances. And the steady state usage of this is, it seems like in a mid-sized community, moderators use it a few times a day. That seems to be like how much they need it. And a few times a day takes a while to get enough data to really to really measure anything, especially if like you're trying to compare whether it works to whether it doesn't, or whether when you're trying to measure according to different groups and things. So this is all stuff we're trying to figure out, and trying to figure out how to evaluate what good is. Like, what does it mean when it works, or what do moderators think working looks like?
Right.
So that's something we're really right in the process of right now, is figuring that out. The initial flow is basically where there's experimental design pieces, but basically right now our basic idea is, I've said basic like 5 times, is just to let moderators react to their log of the nudge saying this helped, like the person improved, it didn't seem to do anything, or things maybe got worse, sort of as a measurement.
Right.
And there's more detail there, but that's like a first pass, just to get moderators' opinions on did this help or not. So yeah, that's about where we are. And some promising results so far. Our goal is to just, again, not put this on every Discord server everywhere. It's just to find the ones that can use it, and there seems to be a group that can use it, and to figure out then what it does on those servers.
So I'm curious about the commonalities on servers that are using it, where you see that it being useful. We've talked about server size. What are the other kind of defining features of the servers that you're finding where this is getting used and is being well received? Is it like, are there commonalities that you've identified?
Yes. So it depends on moderation styles and approaches to moderation, of course. Moderators kind of have to be invested in this philosophy, but also this is not an approach that will work half an hour after the thing happened. Like, you have a specific time window. Right. Which is kind of like when it's happening, or like less than a minute after, or it depends, but it needs to be a space where moderators are watching, as opposed to just responding to reports, basically. Right. Because if they're only responding to reports, they're only arriving after the problem has already happened, at which point a nudge isn't useful.
Right. It's already, if it's going to take off, it's already taken off.
Yes. The problem has already occurred. So it needs to be a space that is kind of like has active moderators watching, but also is of sufficient size that moderators can't just all pull everybody aside. So there's sort of these bounds, and we don't really have enough evidence to be making conclusions about like philosophy or community type yet. I think there are probably some reasonable guesses that could be made about types of communities that might find this more useful versus less. But
frankly, I was just being nosy and curious, and the piece of it that is there needs to be a certain amount of volume, and there needs to be a certain amount of like need for your moderators to be paying attention, is an interesting component to this that just sort of narrows down how this ends up being useful.
Yeah, and we also have to think about like the end goals, which are we want more positive, more productive, safer spaces, etc. Lots of different words you could assign and different for different spaces. But also, we don't want to expect moderators to have to spend more time doing that. We don't want to like say, we want your space to be better, but you have to work harder for that. That's
right.
not the piece that we're aiming for. So the ultimate question is like, does this do better in some way than the current sort of more reactive approaches? Does this work up front decrease the amount of work that has to be done in the long run, or make it a more meaningful type of work, or something else? Because not all moderation work is the same. Some of it is more meaningful than other parts.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. Lots of questions, but we're just at a point of being encouraged that some spaces do seem to be taking a liking to it. So, yeah.
Well, and again, because I think in terms of iterative community design, right, this is a concept that can be, once you've established it, you can generalize it out and be like, okay, so having these impartial, sort of 1 degree removed mechanisms have an impact on how people respond. And just going back to the seeing how someone responds, just immediately knowing whether or not somebody self-identifies as a good actor or not, for me is super powerful and will cut down the energy that goes into being cautious. And that generalizes out and is actually really interesting from a conversation about how do we approach community management and community curation in general. And so I'm excited to hear as this unfolds and as you find the edges of where this is useful and where it isn't. I think it has the potential to provide data that shapes how people curate even in-person spaces. Because if we know that this type of nudge makes a difference, that's really powerful.
I hope so. Thank you. I hope so. And there's lots and lots of things to consider. Like as you were talking about before, the specific language, like the whole. I'm not saying you're sexist, but the language,
don't say
the
sexist
words,
things.
Yeah. The words used there matter in terms of how people react. So the goal with the design is like, we don't want moderators to have to type out custom things for every single situation, but also there's some nuance there in how these are approached. So there's like a limit of 9 total slots that's a Discord limit of commands per app that will go into that menu. So that's kind of the max, and the servers that we've seen using it so far, like between 4 and 6 usually. But anyway, the wording matters, and that's something that will take time to figure out, and exploration and testing and such.
And it leverages community call and response, right? Where if as a community there's a collective stop doing that, right? Or we don't do that here. It's interesting that that can be adjusted. I see an analog between the difference between someone having to actually say out loud, I'm not comfortable with where this role-playing scene is going at a D&D table or a Pathfinder table, versus having an X card on the table and just being able to tap the X card and have the entire table understand, oh, okay, we're changing the subject now. And the difference between having to explicitly communicate it and having it more passively communicated, there's some parallels there that I think are really interesting and powerful.
Yeah, and this isn't necessarily a great example, but sort of a parallel situation would be a person doesn't even need to show they're publicly uncomfortable. Just the group needs to be made aware that somebody is uncomfortable right now.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, not always, of course, the correct answer, but it is a different type of thing. And in fact, one of the first designs we had that, for whatever reason, servers haven't gone with, or maybe one of the possible conversation designs was not like, you've done this thing wrong. It was like, this conversation you're a part of is maybe leading toward a problem. So, be careful as a participant in this conversation to like steer it in you get what I mean. It's like not you did something wrong, but like this conversation you're a part of is
maybe off the rails.
Yeah. So, as a productive member, please do your part to make sure that, so lots of different ways to word all of this and to think about it. Again, I very much don't want to be like the type of person who says just tools will solve all of this. Right. This is not technology will fix all our social problems. This is trying to bring a social process into these spaces in a way that is conscious of everybody's needs and the social dynamics. So tools can only go so far, but we're hoping to find a useful way to support this broader proactive type of behavior with a tool like this.
I'm excited to see where it goes. Like I clearly have a bias towards wanting this to turn into something productive, because I do see all the ways that it connects to various conversations that are happening.
Well, thank you. I'm hoping it succeeds too.
Excellent.
But right. Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
Is there anything else you would like to add or delve into before we wrap up?
I think that pretty much covers the stuff I wanted to talk about. Hopefully, this has been a lot of fun for me. It's been great to talk with you as always. And hopefully it has maybe provoked some thoughts among anybody watching and or listening about how they approach these types of situations when they arise. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Excellent. Where do people find you on social media if they want to follow up?
At Joseph Seering on Twitter is probably the easiest. And I've got other contact info on my website, which is joseph.seering.org.
Okay. Excellent. All right, Joseph, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you for the invitation. Take care.